right? All right, so the nitrogen cycle, very similar to the carbon cycle and the water cycle, in that it is a cycle, which means it's going to explain how nitrogen moves throughout our ecosystem from the atmosphere high up in the earth to the soil, through all types of different organisms, producers and consumers, and then returns back. So nitrogen is super important. It is everywhere as far as the atmosphere. A large percentage of the atmosphere, over 70%, is made up of nitrogen. So it's everywhere. However, nitrogen cannot be used by organisms in the form that it's in the atmosphere. And that is not okay. So we have to do things to it to take it in. And we need it inside of us because it's used in our DNA and other parts of our cells. And it's also used to make proteins, which are super important. All right. So this is a picture of the nitrogen cycle. You can see lots of different organisms in it. We've got some plants or producers. We've got some rabbits, mushrooms, decomposers, and bacteria. So let's learn about the nitrogen cycle. All right. So the nitrogen cycle has 4 main steps that we're going to talk about this year in life science. You could definitely dig deeper, and you will dig deeper when you get to biology in high school, but we're going to keep it kind of basic and focus on the 4 main steps of the nitrogen cycle and whether nitrogen is being released into the atmosphere or being absorbed by organisms. Okay. All right. So the first one is nitrogen fixation. And I say the first step, it's a cycle, so there really isn't a first step. So this is just where we're starting. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to look at is nitrogen fixation, which means we're going to fix the nitrogen. We're going to take the nitrogen that's high up in the atmosphere, in the clouds, and we're going to change it to a form that can actually be absorbed by organisms. So how does that happen? Lightning can strike and it can fix some of that nitrogen that's high up in the clouds in the atmosphere. So it goes into a form that it can be absorbed into the soil as ammonia. Also, this can happen with little bacteria that are on the roots of plants. We call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. Hey, nitrogen fixation, nitrogen fixing bacteria. So they live on the roots of plants, and they can also turn the nitrogen in the soil into a another form that can later be used by plants. And then also you have nitrogen fixing soil bacteria, which means they're not on the roots of plants. They just live in the soil, and they're going to be able to take the nitrogen and turn it into ammonia that can later be used or get into a form that can be used by plants. Okay, so the main organism involved here is the nitrogen fixing bacteria. Whether they're on the roots of plants or just in the soil, it's still nitrogen fixing bacteria that's going to fix the nitrogen or change it into ammonia that can be enter into the soil. All right. So after nitrogen fixation, that's happening here from lightning and also happening in the nitrogen fixing bacteria. It's getting into the soil. All right. The next step we're going to look at is called nitrification. Big word, I know. Nitrification. So nitrification is what happens when you have bacteria that we call nitrifying bacteria, and they're going to change nitrogen that is in the ammonia that's in the soil into nitrogen that plants can finally use. Because the ammonia is actually bad for plants, right? Nitrogen in the atmosphere can't even get into the plants. So that's why we had to fix it. And now it's ammonia. It's harmful to plants. It can kill them. So we have to change it to a form that the plants can use. And they do that by combining the nitrogen with, or the ammonia with oxygen. And that forms what we call nitrites and nitrates. So nitrification is going to be changed to a form that plants can now finally absorb. All right. So now it's going to go from in the ecosystem, in the soil, into our producers of all types. And that is going to happen by way of nitrification, changing it into a form that the plants or producers can finally use without it hurting them. All right. So that's what we see happening here. The nitrifying bacteria, they're all going to change it into forms that the plants can absorb. All right. So the next thing is called denitrification. So denitrification happens with bacteria again, but we call them denitrifying bacteria. So denitrifying bacteria are going to change nitrogen into a form that can now be released and go back into the atmosphere as just regular nitrogen. I'm sorry, which is into, as you see right here, regular nitrogen going back into the atmosphere. That happens by denitrification. And these are bacteria that are releasing it into the atmosphere. Thank you, bacteria, for doing your work. All right. And then the last step that we're going to talk about here in 7th grade is going to be called assimilation. So assimilation means you're kind of putting it together, or assimilating it, maybe breaking it apart a little bit. In assimilation, the plants are going to take that nitrogen that was already nitrified, and they're going to take it in and they're going to use it in their cells just to carry out their life processes they need it for. And then when the animals consume the plants, they're going to also be able to take in that nitrogen into a form that they can use to help them in their cells. And then when the animals and the plants die, decomposers are going to also be using that nitrogen as well in their bodies. Okay, so those are the main things that are happening in the nitrogen cycle. And then once the decomposers or animals poop, they can release ammonia and it'll go back into this whole cycle that we see again. Now, I will admit the nitrogen cycle can be a little bit more complex comparing it to the carbon cycle and the water cycle. But what I really want you to know is that nitrogen is important. The nitrogen that is on our planet, most of it is not in a form that we can use as humans and or as plants and decompose. They can't use it either. And so it has to be fixed, and it could be fixed by lightning or bacteria. And then once it's fixed, it will get changed a little bit more, and then the plants will be able to take it in as a form they can use, and then we get it by eating plants. So that's the main flow that I want you to be able to understand as we discuss this. Okay. Another thing you should know is that when you look at a picture of the nitrogen cycle versus the carbon cycle, you should be able to tell the difference, because usually the nitrogen cycle will have a picture of lightning in it. The nitrogen cycle will have bacteria, it'll have the roots of plants in it. And you'll be able to see also that the plants are taking it in through their roots, whereas in carbon dioxide, you usually see the arrows pointing to their leaves. So hopefully that helps as well to distinguish the two. And usually you'll also see the chemical formula N2 on the picture, or NO2, like you see here, the N stands for nitrogen, and that should help you as well. All right, so we talked about nitrogen. Hopefully I didn't confuse you. And so now we're going to go ahead, go back to our workbook, pull up the nitrogen cycle page. We do have a chart to look at, and we're going to look at the nitrogen cycle brain pop video, which will explain it again in different words, which hopefully will help you. All right, so we're looking at our life science workbook. We have our nitrogen cycle page, and we're looking at the chart. It's kind of similar. You see the light blue parts are the parts you're going to be typing in. Here's a word bank for you for the step of the nitrogen cycle. Your choices are nitrogen fixation, denitrification, nitrification, or assimilation. So those are the words you're going to type in these boxes. I gave you a description. And then in the last column, you're going to say which organisms actually complete this step. Are they producers or plants that are doing it? Are they consumers like the bunnies and the decomposers? Or actually, I left the decomposers separate. Are they bacteria, whether they're on the roots of plants or in the soil? Which ones are actually completing the step and changing the nitrogen for us? All right. So this one says it's fixing nitrogen so that it changes from a gas in the atmosphere into ammonia in the soil, combining nitrogen with oxygen so it can be absorbed by plants, returning nitrogen as a gas into the atmosphere, or nitrogen being used by plants and animals when they eat plants. Okay, I'm going to put the words here, And then you're also looking for one more answer, or two more answers. First one is what non-living thing non-living, it's not an organism, can also fix nitrogen and change it from a gas in the air into ammonia in the soil. And then give one reason organisms like humans need nitrogen. So you're going to be typing that in that box. All righty, let's go back and let's watch our video on nitrogen. Alrighty, so let's see here. This is not the nitrogen cycle. Sorry. I will make sure your link is great. I'm not sure why that one didn't work, but it's okay. So nitrogen cycle video right here. And this is in my way. That's what I do now.
Lunch. What'd you pack for me? Look, for the last time, I'm getting plenty of fiber. Dear Tim and Moby, I thought that air was mostly made up of oxygen, but my brother just told me that it's mostly nitrogen. Who's right? Sincerely, Eloise. Well, you can definitely find both elements in the atmosphere, but oxygen makes up only 21% of it, while nitrogen accounts for a whopping 78%. Hey, we need nitrogen just as much as oxygen. It's a key component of DNA, the body's genetic program for life, and of all proteins, the building blocks of cells. Well, unlike oxygen, we can't just breathe in nitrogen and put it straight to work in our bodies. We need nitrogen in a different form, and we get it from food. Well, it's all part of a process called the nitrogen cycle. See, nitrogen is constantly moving in a big circle from the air to the ground to plants, animals, and humans, and back again. First, nitrogen from the atmosphere falls to the ground thanks to precipitation, snow, rain, hail, that sort of thing. Once it's in the soil, the nitrogen crosses paths with a special type of bacteria. These bacteria often live on the roots of plants in a mutually beneficial relationship. The plants give the bacteria a cozy home, and the bacteria give the plants, well, let's take a closer look. The bacteria latch on to a nitrogen molecule, break it into two separate atoms, and combine each with hydrogen to form a compound called ammonia. Just like that, the gaseous nitrogen has been fixed or attached to other elements to form compounds that cells can use. Right, that process is called nitrogen fixation. Well, actually, ammonia itself is pretty toxic, so before it can be used, it needs to be turned into something else. For this, a different type of bacteria grabs onto each ammonia molecule and combines it with oxygen. This step is called nitrification, and it creates a compound that plants can safely absorb through their roots. Plants use these compounds to build proteins. Animals, in turn, get these nitrogen-based goodies by eating plants and other animals. Well, no, this stuff doesn't stay with us forever, since all living things have to, emit waste. And when plants and animals die, their bodies decay. The proteins and other nitrogen compounds inside them return to the soil. A third type of bacteria breaks these substances back down to ammonia. This process is called ammonification. This new ammonia can go right back into the nitrification step. Well, plants don't absorb all of the substances created at that step. Some of it is snagged by a fourth kind of bacteria. These guys steal the oxygen atoms from those compounds, leaving plain old nitrogen gas as a byproduct. This has the opposite effect of nitrification, so we call this process denitrification. The leftover nitrogen is free to return to the atmosphere, completing the nitrogen cycle. Yeah, human activity can have a huge impact on the nitrogen cycle. Fertilizers, smoke, and sewage from factories, not to mention the wastes of farm animals, all add millions of tons of extra nitrogen to the environment. That throws the nitrogen cycle out of balance, leading to the loss of oxygen in lakes and rivers, soil that won't grow anything, and polluted or acid rain. If we want to keep the delicate cycle of nitrogen moving, we have to take steps to protect our environment. Using alternative energy sources instead of burning fossil fuels is a big help. So is cutting back on the use of artificial fertilizers and properly cleaning up after our livestock. Yeah, I guess that's a start.
All right, so Tim and Moby just gave us some help. They told us some things we can do to help with the amount of nitrogen that was going into the environment, because too much nitrogen can be bad, just like too much carbon dioxide. And then it also should have helped us, I think they explained it very well, with this chart here and labeling each of the steps of the nitrogen cycle and who or which organisms are responsible for completing it, as well as what non-living thing can help with that, and one reason why we need nitrogen as humans. So go ahead if you haven't had a chance to, and you need to fill in this document to make sure you understand or have a thorough explanation of the nitrogen cycle. Alrighty, and I'm going to go back here. All right, so we have learned about all three of the cycles in nature: the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Hopefully you have gotten a thorough explanation of these three cycles. You know what the steps are. You know the difference between the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. You know the difference between the main steps of each one, and you know which organisms are responsible for completing each of those steps. Hopefully you can do those things and identify those and differentiate between those steps. And to extend a little further, there's an optional activity, which is this gizmo here, which is an inquiry-based gizmo on carbon reservoirs. So to do that, you go back to your workbook once again, and you're also going to have to log into your Clever account so that you can pull up this gizmo. So the gizmo that you're looking for is called the carbon cycle gizmo. So you just search carbon cycle once you go into Clever. Now, I cannot exactly show you this because the teacher side of it doesn't look the same as the student side, as far as logging into Clever and logging into Gizmos. But what I can do for you is pull up the Explorer lesson for you to kind of show you from my side what it would look like. And so that's what I'm going to do right now. So if you have the workbook open, you're going to be designing your own investigation, your own lab to see how different things affect the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. So you look at your gizmo first. So let me go ahead. Oops, I should have done that from here. Okay, let me see. All right, so you click on the link, which you already have when you log into Clever. Um, and you'll see this carbon cycle gizmo. Yours is going to be better than this, but this is basically what we're doing. Okay. And so you can see that they have lots of different components here. And if you go back to the lab sheet, which is in your workbook, it says list the possible variables. What things can you change? And what will be affected by the change. Okay, so going back to the gizmo, you can see in the model the sliders. Each of the sliders is something you can change. So you have a slider for initial atmospheric CO2, a slider for plant biomass, a slider for fossil fuel usage, a slider for oceanic carbon uptake, um, a slider for the amount of time. So these are all different things that you can change. And so on your sheet, it asks you what are the things that are possible variables. Then you're going to choose one thing that you're actually going to change. You don't want to change them all. In a good experiment, you have one independent variable, one thing that you're changing on purpose. So choose one of the sliders. It could be any one of these things that you want to change. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to choose the dependent variable, something that you're going to measure. And so the dependent variable for you, oopsies, it can be whatever you want that you're going to get some output from. So it could end up being the amount of any of the other things, which will change as you I'm sorry. Yeah, so as you run your experiment, you'll get the other values will change, and those can be any of the things that you want to measure as your dependent variable. Okay? All right, so you choose whatever you want that to be, you write that there. Then you're going to come up with your question. What is the effect of the IV? So you type your IV from here, there, and your DV on the DV. Some of my students, we say the effect of, which is just this right here, the effect of the IV on the DV. So same thing. And then you're going to form your hypothesis. If the independent variable, whatever it is, changes, however, if it increases, decreases, then the dependent variable, whatever you're measuring, how do you think that's going to change? You also might want to go ahead and figure out in your mind how many trials you're going to run to collect your data. And then you're going to go ahead and you can make your observations. You can take screenshots of your Gizmo and add it here. Any type of data table, if you want to make one of those, you can do that here as well, or a graph. You can do that by just inserting it up here. You have an option that says insert table. So you can do that there. Or a chart, if you want to make a graph, you can do that here, insert a line or bar graph. Okay, so you're going to do that here in the workbook, and then you can add a data analysis. What do you see that supports your hypothesis? What evidence do you have to support that claim, if you think it's true or untrue or whatever, or validated or invalid? And then you're going to draw some conclusions. So this is an optional activity. If you have time to do it, it's a great way to do an experiment online. And then you'll finish that up here. All right. So that is your last activity for today. All right. So what do you do after you've done this? You finish all of today's activities. Make sure you've completed the pages in your workbook for the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Okay. Then if you have time, you're going to finish up that gizmo that I just showed you on the carbon cycle and run your own personally designed experiment, which will be great because we love it when you guys design and test your own plan and test your own hypotheses. And then on Friday, you're going to come back and you're going to complete the Cycles in Nature quizzes and the Cycles Legends of Learning playlists, which these are both not too long, but they'll give you a chance to see if you understand cycles in nature. And then also there's one more gizmo that's an optional activity that you can also do on Friday on the water cycle. So that is basically all that we have today. We have learned a lot of information on the three main cycles in nature, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle, why they're important to us, and how we can help protect our ecosystem. Thank you for joining me again for our Life Science Virtual Lessons Week 2. I hope that this is helpful to you. I look forward to seeing all of your See, Think, and Wonders that you're sharing in that Padlet, and I'll see you again really soon. Have a great day.